wouldn't have guessed it in a million years, but the most common thing you guys have asked to see is all of the acceleration enrichment within Holley EFI. This will work with both the Terminator X and the HP and Dominator, so we're going to cover that in this video. I figure we'll start off going through the software, explaining what each one of the settings in the tables does. After that, we'll throw a car on the dyno and look at some data logs and actually see all the stuff happening in action. And then after that, I will ruin your day and give you the kind of the harsh reality of the acceleration enrichment. Last video, I hit 5,000 subscribers.
I got eyes that I can't even see watching me.
So I just wanted to thank everybody for that. And if you haven't subscribed yet,
it'd be a lot cooler if you did.
Now, if you're not familiar with what the acceleration enrichment is, it's basically the same thing as the accelerator pump on a carburetor. And more or less, when we have a fixed throttle opening and we go to a larger throttle opening in a really short period of time, there's a large burst of air that's going to go into the engine, and that's what we're trying to account for with the acceleration enrichment. In this video, you're going to find out that this stuff isn't really all that exciting or really even quite as helpful as you might think. All right, let's dive into the laptop and take a look at the acceleration enrichment parameters. All right, this is just a generic Holley base map, but if we go over here into fuel and acceleration enrichment, these are all of the settings that we have to make changes. So first and foremost, the number one thing that has to happen before you even consider messing with any of this is that primary fuel table needs to be completely dialed in. If your fuel table isn't dialed in completely, then you're just going to run around in circles with the acceleration enrichment. And the other thing that you're going to want to do with the acceleration enrichment is make sure that the car is fully warmed up when you start adjusting your acceleration enrichment. Once you get everything dialed in with the engine warm, then you can go back and do cold engine stuff. But you're going to make your life a whole lot harder if you try and do this with the engine cold first. So just warm it up and then make your changes from there. So one thing here that is unique with Holley compared to a lot of other ECUs is you see up here in this top row, we have everything here is TPS based, and below that everything is MAP based, which is your manifold pressure, TPS, throttle position. Most ECUs will actually just use TPS and not MAP. I've found that more often than not, you don't need to use or do anything with the map base, and you can actually zero the map stuff out if you wanted to, and then you would just need to run some additional values in the TPS side of things. But I would say that's going to be a little bit more on the advanced end of things. If you're not real comfortable and you haven't done a lot with this, then probably just go ahead and leave the default values for the map based enrichment. But when you go to make your changes, experiment with doing everything just TPS based at first. So the map base would probably be the most helpful in a situation where maybe your car idles at 40 kPa and you're running up to 100 kPa. So you have a pretty big window of change there. But if you have a big cam and you're idling at 70 kPa and you're only going to 100 kPa, there just isn't much happening there. Turbo cars, usually the boost comes in like so gradual that you don't see this being very beneficial. Where it would probably shine though is on some of the supercharged cars that basically go from nothing to everything in a very short period of time. I don't think I've run into any of those on Holley, but again, I haven't really played with that too much. All right, we'll just start left to right, and then we'll go from top to bottom. This first tab here is your acceleration enrichment versus throttle position rate of change. And if we look at our axes here, our y-axis is the actual acceleration enrichment in pounds per hour, and the bottom is the TPS rate of change. And you can see here it's multiplied by 10. So when you look at these values and then you look at the data log, you're going to see that the numbers are different, but that's because of this. So the table values are in pounds per hour, and it's how much fuel we are adding during those acceleration enrichment events. Probably the most important thing that you need to know about setting this up is that if you go into a data log, you can see here that you can actually log the TPS rate of change and the map rate of change. So I'm not even sure what this log is. It's just the first one I pulled up on my computer, but we can see here if I scroll through, our TPS rate of change has a pretty big number. The map rate of change is pretty small. But if we go back into the software, we can see here that where this red ball is where we were in the data log, and you can see this is the position that the engine was running and how much additional fuel it is adding at that point. If you are having a fueling issue at that point, this is where you would make your adjustment. And the main takeaway from this particular tab is this is how much fuel you're going to add during those events. So if you wanted to increase your fueling or decrease the amount of fueling that is taking place during the acceleration enrichment, this is where you would do that, sort of. There is another table that you're kind of they're gonna work hand in hand with one another. We'll jump into that one in a second. Next we have acceleration in TPS versus coolant temperature. Again, this is a big part of why I say get the engine warm first. You can see here at the warmer temperatures, we're very close to 0. You could probably just even, set these to 100 if you wanted to. So once the engine gets to these temperature ranges, it kind of usually just hangs out here and it'll stay there for, a 10-hour drive, as to where when you're in the colder temperatures down here, it's going to sweep through and it's going to stay at these values for very short periods of time. So if you warm the engine up where it's going to spend most of its time, you make all of your acceleration enrichment adjustments, you let the car sit overnight and cool off, and then the next morning, as it's warming up, you realize that it needs some adjustment. This is where you would change it. So this is going to be a modifier from this value. So in this case, it's a percentage multiplier. So as the temperatures are cold, we have, a bunch of fuel that's getting wasted, sticking to a bunch of stuff and all the other crap that it likes to do when it's cold. That's why there's so much more additional fueling at these colder temperatures. I guess something else maybe to take in consideration a little bit is you wouldn't encourage to have crazy rapid throttle movements when the engine's cold. It's probably better to let it warm up before you start going crazy like that. But again, if you need to make adjustments, this is where you would do your temperature-based changes. And then our last tab here is acceleration enrichment correction versus throttle position. So on this one, you can see it's pretty much a straight line. 100%, again, this is a percentage-based correction, so 100% would be 0. So at 60% TPS, the numbers in this table for the TPS rate of change, at that point you're just going to be using this value, as to where if you're at any of these other throttle position ranges, it's going to multiply by this value. So these smaller throttle position openings, you're going to be using more fuel than this base table, and then you're going to be using less fuel at the higher TPS values. All right, if you're not familiar with this stuff, none of that probably made any sense.
Everyone is now dumber.
So let's try to make this a little easier to understand. All right, if we just run through these 3 tabs again real quick, the AE versus TPS rate of change all the way on the left is going to be the amount of fuel that you are going to add during an acceleration enrichment event. The AE TPS versus coolant temperature here in the middle is just a modifier of this based off coolant temperature. So again, warm the engine up, tune this tab here, and then once you're done with that, if you need to make any temperature-based corrections, you would do it right here. And then the AE correction versus TPS is where you're going to make your changes based off of where you're at in the throttle position range as an offset. So the easiest way to kind of describe this table, I think, would be next time you're driving your car, hold the throttle at, say 20% throttle, and then go to 50% throttle, and you're going to see that a whole lot of additional air is going to pass into the engine, engine's going to accelerate, so on and so forth. Now, if you do that same test, but you're at 80% throttle and holding it and maintaining it, and then you go to 100% throttle, you might not even notice a difference. Some engines will actually make more power with the throttle slightly closed. So as this table kind of illustrates naturally, we're going to use more fuel going from a smaller throttle opening to kind of the next step, so to speak, than we would over on this far end of the table, which kind of directly goes with what I just tried to explain. So now when it comes to actually tuning and making adjustments on these tables, what you're going to find is, again, this is where we're going to dictate how much fuel is needed. So you'll find that more often than not, you need the most adjustment in the lower throttle areas. So let's say just like right off of idle, we had a lean spot that we wanted to take care of. So you could kind of bring these numbers up like this. And I'd say it's one of those things where a little bit goes a long way. And you're usually still going to maintain a pretty like linear line, but sometimes you'll have like a little bit of a hump here. This is way too much, just kind of doing it this way so you can see what I'm talking about. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, is there's multiple ways that you can kind of achieve the same result. So if you didn't want to do that, the next thing you can do is go over into this part of the table, and you could bring up this range here, and then I'll still usually try and kind of smooth that out. But basically by doing this, we're also going to be adding additional fuel in the lower throttle position ranges. which is going to be right off idle. Obviously, you're not driving down the road at 0% throttle because the throttle will be closed and you'd be slowing down. But again, this is where you're going to find that the most changes are going to take place. And if we go back to the AE versus TPS rate of change tab, you'll see down here at the bottom, we have AE versus TPS ROC blinking, which is acceleration enrichment versus throttle position. And then the ROC is
ROC, get gunned up and clap quick.
Rate of change. And the blinking, I didn't know what the hell they were talking about. Just the terminologies, I've never seen that phrase in any other ECUs. So I actually had to look in the manual for that one. I think the easiest way to describe this ROC blinking is it's like a filter. So basically we're filtering out anything below 7 here. And this isn't a very real world example, but I think the best way to illustrate it would be like if you're driving down the road and you just made a random left-hand turn into a cornfield and decided to drive through there and the road's real rough and your foot's doing this on the throttle pedal due to all the bumps in the road and all that, you want to ignore all that. Otherwise, if you have acceleration enrichment kicking in and out, you're just going to be throwing a ton of fuel in it. It's probably going to buck and sputter and run like hell. I would say that 7 seems to be a really good starting point, and in most cases 7 just works really well. So if you're not sure where to start, just start at 7, and you know, you can plus or minus this in pretty small increments. I have actually gone both ways on this. Some cars you want them to be less sensitive, so you run a higher number. Other cars you bring this down to next to nothing. A lot of that is going to be dependent on how the car is being used and just kind of how much of an asshole it's being. I would say that the primary thing that dictates basically how much adjustment any of this stuff is going to need is usually based off of the throttle body size. So if you have a 60 millimeter throttle body and you open the throttle from 5 to 10%, and then you have a 160 millimeter throttle body and you go from 5 to 10%, even though the throttle opening is the same, the amount of air that is going to enter the engine is going to be significantly different. And that's usually where the acceleration enrichment kind of takes place. Obviously there's other factors, you know, larger engines, larger intake manifolds, smaller intake manifolds, just any of it can make a difference. But if you take 10 different combos and 10 different throttle bodies, you're going to find that the one with the larger throttle body is most likely going to be the one that needs the most adjustment here. And even though I said you're most likely not going to need to make adjustments here, we'll go through it anyways. So the AE versus MAP rate of change is exactly the same as the AE versus TPS rate of change. So this is essentially how much fuel you're adding during your acceleration enrichment event. This one is a little bit different, which is your MAP AE time versus coolant temperature. So just like the other table, it's going to be making changes based off of coolant temperature. But what's a little bit interesting about this one is this is adjusting the decay rate in time. So what this one's going to do is once you've added your additional fuel real quick, this is going to be the decay rate of how long that fuel stays in there. So the higher the number here, the longer the duration the fuel is going to like slowly taper out. And then we have MAP acceleration enrichment versus coolant temperature, and this one is just a multiplier to this table. So here is our base value of how much additional fuel we're going to add. This is a multiplier of how much additional fuel we're going to add on top of this table when coolant temperatures are cold. And then this table here is going to be, like I said, the duration of how long it decays out. And like I said, I have definitely been in situations where we'll just zero all of this out, and in that case it will require adding some additional fuel in here typically. Most ECUs don't have the map based enrichment. You know, with that being said, you kind of don't need it, but I don't find it to get in the way most of the time, so you can kind of just leave it sort of as is. Just kind of giving you a couple different views of that. And then just like the TPS based stuff, we have this blanking value as well. And again, I've played with that on some cars, just more so like curious as to see how it affects things. Your time's going to be far better spent doing it in the TPS tables. I think I have 2 or 3 Terminator X cars being dropped off tomorrow. So once we get the first one set up on the dyno, we will actually make some data logs specific to the acceleration enrichment, and we'll take a look at that. So I will see you then. I was planning on doing this on the dyno, but this one just not really dyno ready. And this one with the hood exit exhaust, I'm going to spin the car around backwards and face the, the engine bay outside, and it's going to rain, so I'm going to wait and do that till tomorrow. So In the time being, we're just gonna do this stationary, but we can still accomplish what we need to accomplish. So this file is just what this car came in here with. I haven't done any tuning yet. So even though I've been preaching on tune the fuel table first, this car runs and drives, so it hopefully is pretty close, but it's a little bit irrelevant for what I'm gonna show you. Again, rather than showing you the actual values that you're gonna use in the tables, I'm gonna do the same thing I did with the idle video and just show you what the stuff does and swing some stuff like huge both directions so we can see what the difference is. If I was smart, I would have tested this out first to make sure that what I'm trying to show you is going to work. What I'm afraid of is we should theoretically see you know, the difference in the air fuel and in the pulse width and all of that should work just fine, but you might not be able to kind of feel what the car is doing, and a lot of times that's really how you're going to set this stuff up. But anyways, let me try and make it run like crap, and we'll take a look at it. Just to simplify things, we're just going to set everything to the same as far as the target air fuel ratio goes. The fuel graph looks a little weird, so we'll just smooth it out a little bit. Coming in through here and looking, all this stuff looks to be default values from the Holley base map stuff, which is perfect for what we're trying to do here. And if we look at the coolant based enrichment, you can see engine's still cold, so we're gonna let it warm up a little bit. This value here, wherever we end up, is gonna be multiplied by this number. So at this point, that looks to be about, what, 35%. And if you're not familiar with the percentage based enrichments, basically 100% is 0. Anything over that, so 110% would be a 10% enrichment. If it was 90%, then it would be taking 10% away. So that's how that works. A little confusing. I'm gonna start it up, let it warm up, and then once it gets to that point, we'll free rev it, watch what it does with these values, and then maybe we'll zero them out, and then maybe we'll just kind of go crazy throwing a bunch at it and look at the difference. The temperature based stuff, you can see it's just a multiplier based off of temperature. So we're just going to set everything to 100 to get it out of the way for the rest of these tests. This table right here and this table right here are the main things we're going to look at. So now I'm going to free rev it, and you can watch this red ball is going to bounce around. And then you can watch all of the crap kind of take place over here too. So I'm going to try and rev it and not go crazy with rate of change, and then I'm going to do it quicker and make it kind of go further to the right in the table, and then we'll look at the log. So it was actually too bright in the car. I couldn't see the screen, so I came back in here, and I'll go back out again. Up here on the top, we have our engine RPM, throttle position, and manifold pressure. Then down here at the bottom, we have what I would consider to be kind of the more important stuff with what we're actually trying to see here. So we have our TPS rate of change, our map rate of change, and our injector pulse width. And then also our air fuel ratio. And keep in mind, our target air fuel ratio is just, you can see here, it's just a flat line because I just have it the same to illustrate this stuff a little bit better. The very first thing that you need to notice here is our closed loop status. You can see we're in closed loop. And as I scroll over, and once we get to where you can see that I'm opening the throttle, you can see that it goes to open loop. This is why I stress that you need to have the primary fuel table dialed in as best you can, because you're going to be in open loop. The car should run just as good in open loop as it does in closed loop. All right, now if you keep your eye on the purple trace here, you can see once we open the throttle that the injector pulse width jumps like crazy. Now a little bit of that is because we are into a portion of the map with higher engine RPM, and so a little bit of that is just from the fuel table, but a majority of that is from the acceleration enrichment. And then if you look at the blue line at these same points, you can see over here it's relatively flat. But if we come over here, this one's the interesting one. Zoom in on that a little bit. So here you can see, get a little more aggressive with the throttle. Our TPS rate of change is pretty aggressive. And we have some map rate of change going on as well. Pulse width jumps up, but look at the air fuel ratio. It's basically pegging the sensor. Now in this situation, the engine was still running and revving perfectly clean, but here is a spot where we would probably want to add some enrichment. You can see here we're about midway through on how much fuel we're adding here, but we're at the point where we're actually pulling fuel away from this value based off the throttle position opening. So in this situation, we could either bring these values up here, or we could bring the values up here, and ultimately they're both going to do the same thing. So you can play with both and see which one works better for you. So what we'll do with this one We'll zero out 0. We'll go to TPS rated change. Zero that out. Temp we're already at 0. And we'll go to this one here and zero this out. Now I'm going to do the same thing this time, and to be completely honest with you, I've never zeroed this stuff out, so I'm curious to see how bad it's going to rev. So let's fire it up and see what it wants to do. We'll keep an eye on the air fuel, see what it does, but mainly curious to see if it'll pull through. Yeah, you can feel it stumble like crazy. Yeah, that doesn't stumble nearly as bad as I was anticipating though, so that kind of really shows that I'm saying like this stuff can be pretty far off, doesn't make that much of a difference. Hopefully you can hear it. How I was saying, if your Excel enrichment is off, you'll hear it stumble for a very short period of time and then it will stop, and then you're back into like the primary fuel table. Here it stumbles and then it runs smooth again. So like I said before, if you're, you know, rapid on the throttle and it just like doesn't clean up and eventually start revving, the problem's in the fuel table, not in the acceleration enrichment. All right, this worked out pretty well. It actually is going to illustrate a couple of things I wanted to point out here quite well. If you look down here at our injector pulse width in purple, you can see that it's still increasing like I said it was going to because the fuel table is increasing, but you can see it's not nearly as much as it was before. But what's pretty cool is if you look at our air-fuel ratio, it was obviously going dead lean because we have no enrichment at all. You could hopefully hear it in the video. I could hear it with my ears. What else would you hear it with? It stumbled, it didn't run very well. But if you look here at kind of where the throttle opening was happening, and then look how much further and the delay before the actual lean air fuel ratio is picked up. Let's see if we change that scaling. There you go. And then it's consistent. You know, we'd open the throttle. It would be lean, you know, once we were doing this, but we weren't actually picking it up onto the sensor until here. So definitely something to keep in mind when you're playing with this stuff. Not everything's going to overlay and be right on top of each other like you would kind of expect it to. For this one, let's just add a truckload of fuel. Let's just make this 100. And just do the same thing with these. All right, we've added a whole bunch of fuel. Let's see what this does. So actually makes it far worse than being too lean. So let's take a look at this one. If we look at this one, I actually changed the scaling. So if you look at our injector pulse width, it actually shot off the screen. There is so much additional fueling on this one. So you can see it rockets up like crazy. And if we look at the air fuel, same thing as with the lean spike. We're seeing it go pig rich, but it's way after the fact. So the problem is here, but we're seeing it over here. So if you don't take the delay into account, then again, you'll run around in circles. So now you can kind of see like how you would go about finding a happy medium of where the car is happiest. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna swing around the ROC blanking. Okay, so 7 seemed to work pretty well on this car. And let's just move it to 20 or 13 since that's the next break point. Not much difference. 20, 50. Oh, I won't even let you go that high. So really not much there on this particular car. Let's go the other way. Not much there on this car. Some cars you'll find that this number will make far bigger of a difference, but I think this one cooperated a little bit too well, showing, god damn it. Did that really not work again? You raggedy piece of shit. From a logging standpoint, this one doesn't really have a whole lot to show, because even once you're hitting the throttle, you have your blanking window, but you go right past it. If you wanted to really kind of see what's going on with this, you'd probably have to, open two logs at the same time, overlay them and kind of compare. But you'll know it when you have a car that has a problem with the blanking. You'll give it some throttle and usually it'll just kind of fall on its face. And then you'll find that if you can keep adding fuel to either this TPS rate of change table or this correction versus TPS, and you'll see that it's not making a difference because the problem is on the blanking. So at that point, if you bring the blanking down, you'll notice that it will start clearing up and get past it, or it seems to be a little less frequent that it goes the other direction. You'll find that it's like kind of pig rich and falling on its face. So you'll bring those same values the opposite direction and it doesn't get any better. So then if you increase the blanking value, you'll notice that the car starts to run better. The ROC blanking, I basically 100% do that one off of feel and sound. Not the greatest example in the world here, but hopefully helps you a little bit somehow, some way. So the main cliff notes from this video, I would say would be to tune your base fuel table, get that as close to 100% correct as you can. Second thing is figure out and make sure to learn how to log the rate of change in the acceleration enrichment so you can see what's happening, when and where. After that, I would say keep in mind that there is a delay in the oxygen sensor readings. So if you're just chasing an air-fuel ratio number, it might throw you for a loop a little bit. All right, guys, like I said in the beginning of this video, I'm gonna kind of ruin your day here at the end and tell you that a majority of this acceleration enrichment tuning is done off of just feel and experience. I could sit here and talk to you about it for 4 hours straight, but until you actually jump in a car, let me take that back, until you jump into 50 cars and actually start playing and making adjustments and seeing just how drastically different, one car can be to the next in the oddball situations where you kind of need to go crazy with this stuff. The nice part is that you will find that a majority of what Holley gives you relating to the acceleration enrichment is very, very good, very close. You will find that you're gonna need to make very minimal changes. More often than not, it's just off of idle. Obviously, this is something that you're gonna want to data log and make sure that you don't need to make a whole bunch of adjustments. But the best advice that I can give you on this, and I've watched a lot of professional tuners struggle with this, is that just because you're rolling into the throttle does not mean that the problem is in the acceleration enrichment. More often than not, if the car is bucking and sputtering and doing a bunch of goofy stuff, it's usually in the fuel table. Like if you open the throttle real quick and the car is just, and it won't even accelerate, it's not in the acceleration enrichment, it's in the fuel tables, or there's something else that's drastically wrong. The actual amount of time that the acceleration enrichment is active is very, very short. So if you're experiencing something acceleration enrichment related, it's usually just gonna be a really quick kind of hiccup and then you're gonna get past it. And then there's also these things are happening so quick that there's delays in sensor readings and update speeds in the ECU and so on and so forth. So again, like, don't get too hung up in the numbers. Just do what you need to do to make the car run right. And in a perfect world, you should never feel or even know that there's an acceleration enrichment event taking place. So the car should just run perfectly smooth, and that's really about it. So like always, if you have any other questions or you want to see any other specific videos, just let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, that's going to do it for this video. I appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you next time.